Thank you, Dhanidharan. And at the outset, my thanks to my good friend Derek O'Brien and to Professor Gehring and either Professor Junior for taking the time to join us today. The DPF was set up under the kind of slogan that ideas are the lifeblood of a movement, and that the Dravidian movement, which has lasted a century, which is quite a remarkable run for any movement, and run the government of Tamil Nadu for all but 30 of those 100 years in various parties' descendants, was in dire need of rejuvenation of ideas and a re-intellectualization of the political discourse. I am glad to say that despite very little involvement from me, the executive coordinators, Pugal Gandhi, the lawyer, and Dhanidharan, the globally educated management specialist, have done a very good job of really expanding the horizons and bringing in wonderful speakers like this panel from all over the world, and really setting the high watermark for the quality of debate. Thank you for that. Let me switch to the topic of hand. I really don't want to take too much time because I'm an active politician and a sitting minister. So, these are things that I say all the time, and I don't want to repeat myself and use up valuable time from the other panelists. So I'll just make about 3 or 4 points. The first, I think, is that despite the errors of federalism that Dharani pointed out, the greatest contradiction I see is the stance of the Honorable Prime Minister today, Mr. Modi, when he was Chief Minister of Gujarat, and the actions of his government, particularly after 2019, but even after 2014. We all recall that the 13 years that Mr. Modi was Chief Minister of Gujarat, he was the greatest champion of states' rights and federalism. He was the most vocal. He was the most vociferous against the states, the union's intrusion, as he perceived it, in areas like GST, in NEET, in other places, in allocation of funds and so forth. The old adage, where one stands depends on where one sits, seems to apply exceptionally to his case. The minute he ended up in New Delhi, the kind of whole paradigm got shifted, inverted on its head. And starting with the one nation, one X kind of sloganeering, which this administration is very famous for or infamous for, the whole fallacy of homogenization being the basis for growth or standardization being the basis for efficiency started to get implemented one after the other. I've had cause to remark that one nation, one ration card is particularly hard to implement. In Tamil Nadu, for example, in our public distribution system, we have 7 tiers of cards that get different types of benefits, and very few of them get things like wheat. Whereas most of our migrant workers come from the northern states, and they eat very little rice, which is the biggest component of our public distribution system through the ration shops. And most of them eat a lot of wheat, for which we don't even normally have adequate supply. So, it's hard to standardize across the country when a state itself has 7 different types of cards. There are any number of examples, but I don't want to dull the point by repeated examples. The second shift of this, I would say, is on the financial side, and there it has been dramatic. So not just with the onset of GST, which effectively removed the power of taxation or the bulk of the power of taxation from the states. The constitution already left the overwhelming majority of direct taxation with the union, and a small portion of that, and probably 2/3 of the indirect taxation with the states. And after GST, I would say over 75-80% of indirect taxation is also with the union itself. But also, as pointed out, a dramatic shift towards cess and surcharge, which now make up something like 23% of the entire revenues of the union government, and therefore are not divided between the states, to the states. Now, this is particularly galling for states like Tamil Nadu, or for that matter, Maharashtra, where for every rupee of taxes we pay in, on estimate, we get, depending on the state, Maharashtra about 20 paise, and Tamil Nadu about 35 paise back. So the more the government takes into the cess, then it's further, reducing that number, and it starts to become a bit lopsided. Now, in all federal societies, there are net transfers of assets and funds from better off to worse off sub-entities. But in most other societies, those transfers tend to narrow the gap. In India, the greater the transfers, the further the gap seems to rise. Every year, every decade, the gap between the better off states and the less well-off states keeps on expanding, and there seems to be no end in sight. This shift to the centralization of taxes has been accompanied by a deep intrusion into the delivery of benefits as well. So a recent paper, and in fact, it's on the government's website, so we don't need to quote any other web data. The government's websites on direct benefit transfer shows that what was almost zero in direct benefit transfers from the union to people in 2014, last year was about 5.25 crores, or 1.5 times the size of the budget of Tamil Nadu. So the union not only takes 100% of petrol and diesel taxes and the bulk of all other taxes and 23% of total revenues and cesses and 58% or 59% of the income taxes and the GST. And then this decides to bypass the state and the local bodies and go directly to the people as far as possible. Now, of course, we know that this fallacy that, one man or two men sitting as God can direct outcomes is proven to be kind of extreme fallacy every day, because we see not just the failure of schemes like, the Swachh schemes or the Krish Kalyan schemes, where the money doesn't get used properly or gets returned because funds for whitewashing buildings are not used when there are no buildings to whitewash, when schools are run in thatched huts, or when toilets are built but they don't have water supply because that's the municipal administration's responsibility. Or even outright scams like the PM Kisan scams we've seen in Tamil Nadu, where thousands of crores sometimes have been stolen through outright fraud and forgery, and the union government doesn't seem particularly well equipped to catch it. And in the case of our predecessors, neither was the state government. The last point I'll make in terms of concrete shift in the dilution of federalism is about data. With the aggressive use of Aadhaar, which itself has all kinds of limitations in terms of the court's mandates, but whether they're followed or not is a different story. There's also the whole question of the lack of data purity or data integrity, that so many false records have been introduced into the system that even a positive match of a retina or a fingerprint may not mean anything, because enough false records are there that might be an arbitrary record that you then validate with the biometrics. But most of all, it is the use of this data that seems to have no kind of conception of federalism. The union government owns the bulk of this data. It uses it whichever way it wants. It feeds it to its partners, like the Jio phone company, in ways that are, questionable about the separation of, public versus private entities. And yet, states don't have access to the data nearly as well as private entities like Jio do. I'll, 2 or 3 other examples: the whole electoral bond model, where only the union government agencies know, and therefore the union government knows. So the rest of us don't know who gives the money, where it comes from. Kind of institutionalized corruption, if you will, or rent seeking. The income tax data, which again, very few of us have adequate access to, where we decide to have a means test for our benefits. And even something as basic as the vaccination data, which required all the inputs to be put into the CoWIN portal, but the states did not have access to at least the granular data. We didn't have any access at all. When we finally asked and repeated, we were given at a gross level, at like a district or a city level, but that doesn't help us. When we want to do pandemic kind of countering, we have to know street by street, block by block, where the gaps are in vaccine penetration, and overlay that with the antibody sampling and with the kind of demographic modeling to know where are the high-risk groups. But we don't have access to the data. So it's ironic that we find that those who have the data either don't use it or use it, immorally, if not outright illegitimately. and then the rest of us who actually could use the data and legitimately use it to benefit our efficiency and delivery of our schemes don't have access to the data. Now, the question that's always lingered in my mind is, it's one thing for non-BJP states like, BJP government states like West Bengal or Tamil Nadu to kind of rail against this and our political philosophy and our federalism principles are aligned with the current situation. I've always wondered why it is that the BJP states who suffer just as bad outcomes, whether it is Gujarat or UP or Karnataka or any of these, why are they not champing, at the bit and saying, this is no good for us. We don't have access. We are powerless. We are beholden to the efficiency or lack thereof of your execution. We want to be masters of our own destiny, at least as far as the Constitution provides. And I've started to think that maybe we're reaching a breaking point on that, in the sense that, of course, the organizational strength and capabilities of the RSS and of the Hindutva ecosystem are far superior at a national level, at least to anybody else. Many of us are regional parties, and the once national party of the Congress is not anywhere at the organizational capability that the RSS and the BJP have. So it is that organizational strength that has kept the system under suppression. But even that, I think we're starting to see the limits of that. Both in the GST Council, where I'm a member, I'm starting to see even BJP states start to question whether this kind of centralization of power and decision-making and lack of access and input to the states is a sustainable model. And I think we have also seen that through the kind of political turmoil in places like Karnataka and places like Uttarakhand, Gujarat, where the regime change within the party has had to be facilitated once or twice or multiple times, shows you that maybe the system is starting to creak. And the natural tendency for all human beings to want to be free, to be with self-respect, to have some control of their destiny, to have self-determination, is starting to rise and bubble up, even through the massive kind of organizational suppression skills of the RSS and the BJP. So with that, I'll leave it there and just look forward to learning from the views of the other panelists. And then if there are any questions that I can jump in at the end, I'm happy to do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time, sir. Thank you. Adil, I think now we'll go ahead and ask questions. Mr. Jai Shankar has been waiting to ask his question for a long time. So Jai Shankar, you can just go ahead and ask your question. Please tell me to whom the question is directed.
The question is to our finance minister. This discussion here, we are talking about safeguarding federalism. However, any authoritarian or central unitarian government grabs the power in the name of nationalism. So that is what BJP is also doing. Like PTR said, in 2001, Mr. Modi was the champion of states' rights, but whereas 2014 onwards is exactly against of whatever he has been preaching when he was a chief minister. He is trying to grab all the powers into Delhi. This grabbing of powers always happens in the name of nationalism. So what is the action plan of regional parties to convince their electorate that regional ethos, culture, heritage, or linguistic importance is more important than a nationalism? So what are the plans? How are the regional parties planning to approach this nationalism versus regionalism? That is my question.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to speak for all regional parties, of course, but I will speak for ourselves. And I think the ideal point is that we don't want this debate to be about nationalism or not nationalism. We want the point to be about performance, about delivery, about compassion, about outcomes. And at least in the case of the DMK government now, where we want to show the distinction between ourselves and the government in Delhi is in the extent of inclusion, the extent of fairness, the extent of equity in outcomes, not just in intent, and most of all in execution. The greatest weakness that this government in Delhi has And normally we should not be talking about one government, right? Because we are talking theory. We are talking, like Professor Gehring said, that this is about the theory. Which model is better suited? What are the pluses and minuses of every model? But because we have this extreme government, we are forced to talk about in response to them. Really, the debate should not be in response to them. But in response to them, the single biggest weapon we have is good performance and good outcomes. Because, while they are excellent at authoritarian kind of power grabs and at the projection of almost a kind of extortionist, mindset, they are not at all good at delivery. They are not at all good at actual performance. The economy has seen, continuous shrinkage. Unemployment is rising. And at some point, it's only because people don't have hope or people perceive that all outcomes are going to be bad outcomes. Now, at least let me feel uplifted by belonging, by being in the majority because of othering somebody else. It is this kind of low road populism, demagoguery, rabble rousing, call it what you will. And the way to fight that is to actually show that there is a high road. There can be compassionate policies that deliver growth, that deliver jobs, and that give you good outcomes. And I just use one example to prove my point, that I have often said that Tamil Nadu is probably the most practicing Hindu percentage state in India. Everybody goes to the temples all the time. Every street has temples. So is it not a bit ironic, or at least contradictory, that in the most Hindu state in India, the BJP, as the professor said rightly, is not able to even grab a toehold, right? They're constantly fighting around the 3% mark. I mean, last election was an exception. They got their kind of beholden allies to gift them a few seats. But in reality, let's say we look at municipal elections, they're not going to make any inroads at all. They're almost irrelevant. So clearly, in some way, Tamil Nadu has figured out this formula. That is, that if you provide opportunity, jobs, education, upliftment, and some measure of equity, then you don't need to other somebody to feel good about yourself. Your life actually improves and you can feel good about yourself. And I think that's really the approach that we want to take, at least as a DMK.
Thank you, sir.
There's one question for the Honorable Minister from Mr. Mukesh. His question is, why is birth/death certificate now being centralized? Why no state governments are opposing it tooth and nail? The more the data is centralization, the more we move towards dictatorship. Erosion of state power is very rampant with this BJP government in the union. If this rampant appropriation of state power doesn't stop, then it will lead to fight for self-determination much vigorously.
Yeah, I agree and I disagree. I couldn't agree more that we need to make sure that 100% of all inputs go to the union and 0% of the utilization of that data comes to states, which is the model now is not a sustainable model. We all fail as a people because of that. I disagree a bit in the sense that, there's a big gap between authoritarian ambition and authoritarian reach. I've said this before, that the kind of reach of these authoritarians far exceeds their grasp. Just because they have the data, they're not actually able to use it. They use it effectively in individual cases, or they use it as a threat, almost extortionary threat. But you don't see actually, maybe it's because Tamil Nadu is an exception. Maybe it works really well in UP. I don't know. My experience is limited. But in places like Tamil Nadu, we don't see the union government's actions or policy making or direction being well managed by the data. And you see, part of the problem here is that, this God complex, make it so because I said so, does not work unless you can bring a mechanism that actually executes that. And the government, as I've discovered after coming to sit in office for the last 6 months, is broken. Just because we think the data exists in the system. Now, let's take the Aadhaar. when the Aadhaar was supposed to be seeded aggressively quickly, tens of vendors or hundreds of vendors were engaged all over the place. Now, the whole notion of a national unique identification database is that it must be free of impurity in injection, right? It may have spelling errors, it may have these things, it may have the mistake of one person having, randomly applied it to different points. And these must be way exceptions to the rule. You must have 99.9% or so accuracy in the control of validating that unless there was a birth and therefore the birth leads to a social security number request, or there was a citizenship transformation or there must be some paper trail that leads to these, and it must be one by one. Well, once you had hundreds or maybe even thousands, if I really think about it, vendors who are asked to do this job, we have heard of so many cases of the injection of records where a name, a face, a retina, and a fingerprint or a set of fingerprints match, but all of them are fake, meaning the person doesn't exist on that name. Some human being exists with those physical features, and they're entered as having some name and some age and some detail, and there is no verification or validation of this done, right? And these databases are so large that the only real kind of current use of these databases for validation is if I put in a name and say, does this fingerprint match this name? The database can say yes or no. I can't put in a database and say, search me the 1 something billion records that you have and tell me who is this. Those kinds of applications just don't exist in the country. So if you have now introduced completely fake data for the sake of getting additional benefits or escaping the system or whatever it is, once you admit that there are, let's say, 10,000 or 50,000 fake records in the original database, then no validation of a human being is worth anything, because I don't know if the original entry was a valid entry or not. So what a country like the US through Social Security, or the UK through NHS, or or Singapore through the NRIC, what they did painstakingly, individual by individual, birth by birth, citizenship transformation by citizenship transformation, we tried to do in a rush. And though we claim we were leapfrogging people to go to retina scans and fingerprints and all, it's only as good as the integrity of the data in the first place, and the data is irreversibly compromised. So the same thing goes, let me give you this birth and death because it's closer to the question. When we look at the birth and death registers in the civil record, in the civil register, in many cases, the number of deaths registered have come down after the COVID pandemic. That's not possible, right? I mean, it's just not possible, because we know that the gross death rate has gone up quite a bit because of the pandemic. Hundreds of thousands of people have died across the country, millions probably. And in Tamil Nadu, tens of thousands at least. So the system breaks down because you have all this extra work to do, because it's staffed by the same people, because it's a new process, because there's no checks and balances. Even at a state level, when we had the COVID second wave, I'm super impressed and happy and proud of the way we were able to bring it under control in 2 months, just having come to power, not having been in power for 10 years. All of the good things I say are, something to be happy about, something to be proud about. But there was no effective tracking mechanism for how donations were received and dispersed. I'm not even talking about cash. Cash goes into the Chief Minister's Fund, that's okay. But if money was donated at government hospitals or at district offices or equipment or concentrators or medical supplies, there is no mechanism. There was none put in place to track how these came and how they went and where they went. So, that's the kind of trade-off we made, because the government is just not designed to do things like this. So though I am 100% both cautious and philosophically against the notion of the center of the union intruding into things that it has no reason to be in. Some things are not that worrying to me, number one. And many things are the kind of alleviating factor for me is that there's a huge gap between intent and execution. And so far, at least, the union government has not shown that it has anywhere near the execution capability required to do large-scale kind of big brother. He can do individual extortion very effectively. We've seen that. But it's not yet got the capability, and I don't think it'll be anytime soon, because nobody has all the skills. Once you concentrate power and decision making into two people, it's very hard to build an effective system that can then police 1.4 billion people to the level of a big brother that you would like. So it's an inherent contradiction in terms, and we see the evidence of that every day.
Thank you so much, sir. There's a question from DPF member sent it to me in WhatsApp. His question is, it's very clear that BJP is trying to destroy every tenet of democracy as well as federalism. Is it so? Will Indian democracy survive after 2024 if BJP still wins? And what are the plans that the DMK party has for the 2024 election? That being very important for Indian democracy as well as federalism.
Look, we are a democracy. Yes, we are an elected autocracy in some ways, as my friend Derek O'Brien put it. But at the end of the day, the people get the government they deserve. If we have arrived at this pass where the poorer, those without hope north, end up voting for division rather than for their pocketbooks or their stomachs, it is an indictment of society as a whole, right? It's a telling distinction that in those states on the coast and in the south, in the west, even in Gujarat, the BJP's kind of hold has started to fade, because once you have affluence, once you have education, once you have progress, though Gujarat is one of the highest Gini coefficient disparity states. People start thinking for themselves. Also, places that still have their own language. That has been a big distinguishing factor. Wherever people have held on to their native language, the BJP has had much less success than places that have given up their native languages for Hindi kind of homogenization, which is precisely why the BJP tries again and again to push Hindi down and to try and homogenize the rest of the country by stripping away regional identity. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, whether it's even Karnataka, where Kannada pride is resurgent, suddenly in the southern states, suddenly in the western states, in the eastern states, so forth, all the way from kind of Maharashtra back to West Bengal. This belt is not susceptible because of its identity and its language. As for the 24 election, we are a regional party. There's only really one primary objective, and that is for us to win all 40 seats, including Pondicherry, which we did almost, we won 39 or 40 in 2019. We are fairly confident we'll win 40 or 40 in 2024. The bigger issue, though, and this is really the goal for us, is not just to win our 40 seats, because at the end of the day, out of 542 seats, the 40 seats, while they're important, are not going to be the game changer or the determiner of the final outcome. The final outcome depends on whether the Hindi belt kind of decides to vote with its pocketbook and its chapati bowl, rather than with its kind of divisive mindset and othering and this kind of jingoism. And that, I think, what we can really do is provide an example, as I've said before, that really there is another option. There is the possibility of actually making progress, of actually having jobs, of actually seeing growth, of delivery of goods, of delivery of public infrastructure, of services. And to say, if that is possible in Tamil Nadu, then why is that not possible in Rajasthan or UP or Bihar? And that is the message really that I think we can add value to the national election. Otherwise, we're a regional party, and the immediate prospects are just for us to win our seats, which we have done before and we'll do again. I'm fairly confident of that. But we want to change the nature of the debate. We want to change the debate towards what is in the interests of society. What does harmony, the rule of law, a compassionate framework provide, not just for quality of life, but also for growth and progress and prosperity. For example, even our political opponent, Ms. Jayalalitha, her slogan was Amaidi Valam Valarchi. Peace, law and order, a calm, a stable, then prosperity and growth. So, that I think most educated people understand, that you can't have a society in turmoil and fantastic growth rates, at least not in a sustained way. And we want to show that if you have a calm, harmonious, relatively speaking, society and a thoughtful government and capable execution, you can see significant progress in 2, 3, 5 years. And in the case of our government, it will be 3 years between when we came to power and the 2024 election. So the best contribution we can make to the broader national election is to do a really good job of administration, providing new jobs and showing growth and prosperity, and hoping that will influence the national mindset and the national debate.
So thank you so much for your time. I think with this we could close the event. We're already 2 minutes late. So I thank everyone for coming, especially the minister for his time, and for Adil for coming at the last minute notice, and the Professor John Gehring from US to have joined us. Thank you so much, everyone.